this is an opportunity to look at where the global industry is moving on growing media. And although our panelists are based in Europe, I may pick on some people, so make sure you're concentrating as we go through. It's sustainable growing media is a big issue for some countries, but less so for others. But as a responsible sector, it's really time to consider the arguments and solutions for what is increasingly an international discussion. It seems to be a topic that has followed me through my career. When I first did my Saturday job in a garden centre in the UK, the pile of peat-free growing media was the pallet in the corner that hardly got looked at. And in fact, if the customers came in, they'd say, well, if it's missing peat, it's missing the main bit, so I won't have that. And now the whole thing has moved on and changed. When I started my working consultancy in '97, one of my first jobs was looking at doing alternative media trials on lavender. And so in the UK, this has been something which has been an issue for a long time. There were targets for reducing peat as the topic of needing to tackle the issue of biodiversity and the habitat loss that came with peat. Well, from then, many of the peat bogs were then protected. That was no longer an issue. And then the carbon discussion came in about the use of peat, and that became the top environmental reason after that. In my time in the Horticultural Trades Association, we brought in the Growing Media Association, and I found myself working with the manufacturers and the growers and setting up initiatives across there back in the early 2000s. But now, here we are in 2025, and we're going to consider this issue across Europe and potentially around the world with all of your opinions. So to do that, I'm very thankful to the panel who has joined us today, and I'm going to give them each just an opportunity to introduce themselves and their organization before we go on to some questions. So just a brief introduction and your organization. We'll start, please, Cecilia.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Cecilia Luetgebrune. I'm the Secretary General of Growing Media Europe since now 9 years since Growing Media Europe was founded. And yeah, GME, as we like to call it, is the European Association for Producers of Growing Media and Soil Improver, and the only European association for this sector. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation, Tim, and to the team at AIPH for organising such an excellent conference. So I'm Jennifer Pheasey, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Horticultural Trade Association in the UK. Our membership has 4 categories. So we have growers, we have retailers, we have suppliers and the growing media manufacturers that Tim's mentioned, and also landscapers. I should say I'm a policy person and a sort of political engagement expert, having worked in the industry for just 3 years, but I'm delighted to also be joined here today by Martin Bryce, who's over there in the corner, who is one of our members who works very closely with AIPH, and will certainly take any very technical questions about growing media. But looking forward to the debate.
She's very worried that I'm going to ask her about the chemical constituents of alternatives. Thank you.
Great, then I will close the round. Hello to everybody, and thank you again for the invite. First time to be here for myself. I'm Julia Ostrowski. I'm working at Meo Carbon Solutions. We are an international consultancy that has focused on supporting sustainable supply chains in different perspectives. And we have started and recently finished the development of the first certification scheme for sustainable peat substitutes that I am going to present to you later. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. My first question is to Jennifer. And so the use of peat in the UK is something that has been contentious for more than 30 years, really. But in reality, it has still stayed as the core growing media ingredient for most of this time. We know that the UK government planned to ban the use of peat in horticulture, and many in the sector have been proactive in moving away from peat. But what is the current situation, and how are UK growers and retailers reacting to it?
Thank you, and it's a very good question, and one that I get asked a lot, because I think the first and foremost point you've made there is that the sector is committed to a peat-free future, and all the stakeholders who are involved in both the debate and also customers also are expecting a peat-free future. But you notice I use the word future, so we do not have a peat ban, we do not have the legislation or the legal basis for a peat ban yet in the UK, but the debate is very much around when, not if, and that's really where we are today. And a whole range of businesses have taken different steps to be on that peat-free journey. A recent survey we did found that around 25% of growers are already completely peat-free. As you've said there, from a retail perspective, we're virtually at peat-free, with some retailers choosing to only sell peat-free bagged growing media. And some of that is from a sustainability strategy. Well, like we talked about earlier, it's a decision from the board. Some of it is around customer demand. We're particularly hearing from, say, for example, the larger supermarkets that they're looking for significantly peat-reduced products to be supplied into them. And there is still a very live NGO-led kind of environmental debate pushing for peat-free horticulture in the UK, and we can't, move away from that being where we're at. However, I think what we need to celebrate is the fact that huge investment has been made by the sector in achieving peat-free. So now our sort of latest data shows that growers are around 30% by volume of peat use, and retail, as I've said already, is well on the way. I think we would say regulation isn't necessarily needed. The trajectory is very much set, but it's not easy. And it is really complex, and it's not a switch from one to another. The other is a whole range of different things which make up alternatives to peat-free, and it is difficult. And we import a lot, so we know our supply chains are not just domestic. So it's not something that can happen overnight.
Okay, thank you. And as HTA, as the industry association, how are you supporting growers as they face those challenges for change?
I think there's three main ways that we can do that, and actually it's like we would handle any other technical issue that a grower needs to transition to or change, whether that could be anything. But the main things are around technical support. So we are holding lots of workshops, and we are also working in partnership with the likes of the Royal Horticultural Society, the RHS, to run peat-free fellowships to bring academia together with industry and growers to take the time to work through it scientifically, to trial and test. So that's absolutely a key one, and that knowledge transfer is key. The other area is around communication, and particularly to consumers, because they need to handle these products differently. They need to irrigate differently, the nutrition is different, and they need to understand that they won't have the same experience they had previously. And then the third area that we're working on is the one that I particularly lead on, which is around policy and engagement. And I think we heard earlier around that need for certainty, and there is certainly a demand for policy certainty, but the right kind of certainty, which means we can sustain a successful sector going forward.
Good, thank you. And Cecilia, more recently, Germany has also become more proactive in seeking to reduce the use of peat. What measures are being taken there and more broadly across the EU? And do you see EU legislation, how do you see EU legislation affecting growing media?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to make one big comment, because it's often, two things are often confused when you say a sustainable growing medium. There is no such thing as a sustainable growing medium. Let me tell you that. If you look in the scientific community, there is no accepted definition of this is a sustainable growing medium. You can compare growing media and you can say this one has a lower environmental footprint. Of course, that's what we're doing. But the term a sustainable growing medium, and then that's kind of the same as peat-free or peat-reduced. I'm sorry, but from a scientific point of view, that is just not true. So please, I always advocate for stop saying that. You can say peat-free if it's really peat-free, that's a fact, of course, you can call it that, or peat-reduced, but don't just call it a sustainable growing medium and kind of imply that means peat-free is sustainable, because it can be, but it's not by default. So that's just one thing. Then for the German government. Yes, the German government has what is called a peat reduction strategy. A very important point as well to clarify, this is not a law, it's not even a proposal for legislation, it's a strategy, so it's basically a declaration of intent, it's communication. There's a lot of confusion. We often have people saying, oh, but Germany banned peat. No, same as in UK. In reality, no. It's just, a declaration of intent, a strategy. There's no binding factor there. The good thing about it, from our perspective, is that it has boosted research into non-peat materials, which is very good news because we need them. If you look at, I'm sure you all know the figures from Wageningen University, the prognosis on the demand for growing media worldwide is skyrocketing, to say the least. So GME's position is very clearly, we don't need less peat, we need more peat, and we need more of everything else. So to say it very bluntly, as soon as it works and it's safe, we take it. That's the simple message we have from GME. When you go back to the German government, yes, so there's a strategy. There is now, just last week was confirmed, there will be a roundtable with the German ministry starting in January. I will try to join that roundtable as well on behalf of GME, as I happen to be German. That's a coincidence, but yeah. And the German government, of course, has made some announcement that they will push for some European legislation because, different to the UK, Germany is part of the European Union and it's legally impossible to ban peat or any other material on a national level. That's impossible. So as long as there's no push from European level, and I don't see that happening, I mean, that's my main job to kind of prevent that, it's not going to happen. So yes, lots of research into other materials, more like, so the share of peat in some applications will probably go down, is going down, and that's good because we simply don't have enough raw materials overall. But on European level, there is at the moment no big move to go towards less peat. It's really Germany. There's a bit discussion here and there, but if you go to Italy, Spain, Spain's the biggest horticultural producer in Europe. I talked to the Spanish government, they said, why on earth would we reduce the peat? We depend on peat. It's our horticultural sector that depends on it. It works very well. As far as we know, there's no big problem with it, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I think you raise a very interesting point, of course, about what is sustainable. How do we put it in this context? And of course, in our UK situation, maybe Germany too, the issue has kind of been taken over by the NGO lobby. And certainly it was easy to say, peat is bad, everything else is good. Because it's a simple message. And the science and the argument, you can argue a lot about whether it is or isn't, alternatives and so on. A little bit like the pesticide debate in Europe, maybe, that all pesticide are bad and must go, rather than looking at the science and all the everything that goes behind that. But we're in an industry where we have to manage not just the science, but also the perception. And I think industry bodies need to decide how they will handle that within their industry and how they will manage the different stakeholders who may or may not be interested in the actual science and what is the right strategy for the industry. So I think, but you raise the right question, and of course it's our job in the industry to stand up for the science really, and what is clear and what is right, at the same time as supporting the sector in how it moves. I want to introduce Julia now, and I'd like you to explain what Horticert is. I suspect there are people here who don't know, and why there is a demand for such a scheme, and what role will it play in the longer term, and how do you see it changing and developing? And I know you've got a few slides just to illustrate that, but over to you, Julia.
Yes, thank you, Tim, and great that I could bring some slides. I think they're very good in supporting, so to make you understand and introduce you to the system. So I have told in the beginning that we were able to develop the first certification system for sustainable peat alternatives, and as we've heard from Cecilia, it is important that we look at the alternatives. It's not about, per se, prohibiting peat use, but looking at the alternatives to make them at least minimum sustainable, so that we're not going from the one bad situation into the other. And I think I don't have the clicker, but if you can just go to the next slide, that it's fine. Great. Yeah, also what we've already heard, also this initiative and the development comes from the discussion about peat reduction, about the impact of peat extraction on mainly the climate, but also on other ecological aspects. And we have also heard that the German government has its climate reduction strategy, climate protection strategy, and yeah, with the peat reduction, there are the two goals over the next years in the longer run to reduce or even end the use of peat. That was the, let's say, the motivation next to the overarching goal to protect peatlands and to work on climate impact, that the ministry, the Federal Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Regional Identity has asked for the development of such a system, which is today named Horticert, so the certification system for sustainable peat alternatives. If we go to the next slide. And what we mainly cover, what our three pillars and focus areas are, as said, are the sustainable cultivation, production and processing of all those raw materials that could be an alternative to peat. We do cover this along the entire supply chain, so from the production, from the cultivation, up to its use in the growing media. And secondly, as we are talking about covering the entire supply chain, we are talking about traceability, transparency in forwarding information about the sustainable production along the supply chain. So also this is an important factor for the scheme. And last but not least, the topic on greenhouse gas accounting, meaning an aligned methodology to verify the climate impact of such alternatives in comparison to peat, where we are also collaborating and aligning with the GME methodology that you might already know, the guidance on the accounting for growing media. All is verified, and I think that's what you all know from typical certification schemes by independent third parties. So also with our scheme, we are working together with certification bodies that are trained to test and to audit on an annual basis. Next slide, please. And just to come up with some figures where we are standing. So this whole system was developed over the past 4 years in a multi-stakeholder approach and dialogue. We have contact with stakeholders along the entire supply chain, but also listening to NGOs, universities, research institutions, and individual experts in specific fields. We are currently covering the, let's say, volume-based most important alternatives, so from green compost over composted bark and wood and cocoa-based alternatives. We are working together with 4 certification bodies by today, and since last year, where we entered into force, have already issued like 18 certificates in 5 different countries. And yeah, the outlook is, of course, to make the system grow, to cover more, and become even more international. Yeah, that's just to us. So my colleague Leon Wienbeck and myself are here the entire day in case you want to get in contact. And yeah, that was the brief introduction into the system. Now getting back to your question, Tim. So I would say why there is demand for this, or what we want to contribute to the developments, is being part of the impact that certification as such has on the movement towards more sustainable production. I mean, the majority of the people here are from, let's say, the downstream supply chain. So when really we're talking about the production of the plants, of the flowers, but it in the end all starts in the substrate. So it's relevant to also have a look at this and to cover this part of the supply chain as well. So our system, where we see the demand, is on the one hand to bring a certain alignment, for example, on the topic of greenhouse gas accounting, but in general also to support a compliance with regulations that we have heard from the previous speaker. There are a lot of challenges coming up with EU regulations, with national regulations, where certification can play a crucial role. It's not directly meaning that you are compliant, but it can help to, for example, streamline processes, guiding towards the right decisions on becoming more sustainable. And it also brings up the demand to cover more than just those that are currently important based on the volume of alternatives. So also having the new materials that have potential to support the change to more sustainable growing media heard and also communicated. As I said in the beginning, the certification is already there for horticulture in general, but we want to complement by also covering the production of growing media. So also having here a detailed monitoring and a continuous improvement of the production of substrates. And another point that we had experience with in the past is that we can help to clean up with prejudice in specific or for specific materials. As an example, the production of alternatives from cocoa-based materials, like cocoa pith, cocoa fiber, if that is a word for you. There are prejudice both at the consumer side as well as at the potentially grower side, or those who are using growing media for their plants, that this might be bad, climately bad, socially bad, and with the certification scheme we can help to clarify, to bring out what is really the case, both positive as maybe also critical, and then to come to a realistic communication, not only for this, but in general to promote also the efforts many pioneers have done in the industry of growing media to a more sustainable future. So I would say there are a lot of things that I see, and certification in general, together with our scheme, is a long-term investment.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction of the scheme, and I'm sure it could be interesting to see what the role that it will play in helping to support the sector into the future. Now, Cecilia, there's a broad support for making the horticulture industry more sustainable. We all see that. How is GME and growing media manufacturers supporting this goal, and can you share any of the developments that will lead to sustainable growing media, recognizing you don't accept that expression? However, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if I would want to give a very simple answer, you ask me how to make horticulture more sustainable, and how do we contribute to that, I would say simply by existing. Because we all know that a plant grown in and this is important, fit for purpose, right? So adapted to the specific plant and application. A plant in a fit for purpose growing medium is good news for this planet. That is something that has to be understood much better. You need less water, less fertilizer, less chemical plant protection, less arable land. So everybody who says, I'm an environmentalist, I care about the planet, I want to fight climate change, become a fan of growing media and of modern horticulture. Ideally in a high-tech greenhouse, that's the lowest footprint you can get, right? So because you saw the Green Deal goals, but also in general, as a society, I think we all agree we want more plants in our lives, not less, more. We should eat more fruits and vegetables for many reasons. We want to have greener cities. We want to have afforestation. So plants, plants, plants. If you want all those plants, I think everybody agrees until this point, we want those plants to be produced with the lowest environmental footprint and of course socially fair as well, right? But let's focus on environment. If you want all those plants, how to produce them with the lowest environmental footprint? The answer is growing media. It's as simple as that. And that's why the demand is exploding. Because we have these goals in Europe, not only in Europe, Asia is a huge, huge, huge market. China, by the way, just built a port, brand new, with the sole purpose of importing peat, only peat. So if Europe thinks that if we decrease a little bit the peat and then we save the planet, because that's the story you hear, sorry, it's bullshit, pardon my French, it's really, it frustrates me so much to hear these stories. It's just not true. Do you know how much of the European peat lands our sector is using? 0.1%. So if people go, oh, we have to stop using the peat and then we're going to save the climate, sorry, no. If you really want to help the climate and you are about peatlands, like only peatlands, yes, you should restore peatlands, absolutely. There's far too many drained peatlands out there, but who is using them? 90% agriculture, forestry. Yeah, so, right, I'm not saying it's not a problem that there's drained peatlands out there, and our sector is, by the way, the only industry sector who restores peatlands. There's NGOs who have the knowledge, and then there's us. We have the knowledge, the machinery, and so on. And we are more than willing and open to help reach those restoration goals, like beyond our own areas, which we, of course, restore anyways, right? But then, maybe to zoom in more, GME, what are we doing? We have started in 2018 a big project, a life cycle assessment. We have developed guidelines, second version, a tool, all of that. We are a small NGO, right? We are 2 people working at GME. I have 1 colleague, right? So just to give you some ideas. It's a huge project that costs us a lot of money. And of course, we don't do the calculations ourselves. We work with experts, bargaining and so on. But we wanted to understand better the footprint of our products, right? But with the LCA, what is very important to understand is you can look at a footprint on a raw material level. That's one level. Then you can look at a footprint of a mix. But what is most important, if you really want to achieve like a horticulture production chain with a lower footprint, you have to look at application level, because if you mix something together and say, look, this growing medium has a very low environmental footprint, congratulations, but then if the grower needs double the amount of fertilizer and 10 times the amount of water, and after a week that plant is dead, what's that for sustainability? So sustainable means also good quality. If a growing medium is not fit for purpose for the plant it's supposed to help grow, it's not sustainable in no way. So don't forget that. Look at the value chain. If you look at the environmental footprint of a plant grown in a growing medium, do you have any idea of how much of that footprint of the plant is coming from the growing medium? It's marginal. It's ridiculous, which doesn't mean that we are like we have no responsibility. No, every part of the value chain has to look at their share and say, look, how can we bring down the footprint of our products? And that's what we're doing, but we can't do it like in a vacuum, like disconnected from the rest of the value chain. Then we really don't help sustainability at all. So that's just something I really constantly repeat and hope everybody understands.
Thank you, and we can tell how much you feel about it. I think that's good, and I think as an industry, I think where we can promote the science, and this is the right thing to do. I think this is why also we've included the UK in this discussion, because this was an argument also having 20 years ago, and I think the strategy of the industry has moved on and changed a bit. So I want to ask Jennifer just to follow that a little bit, because I suspect you're not having those kind of discussions now too much, but you are looking at how the industry is becoming more sustainable. And I wonder what are the main challenges that growers in the UK are facing in making changes to fit with the objectives of government, thinking about quality, price, customer demand, and how is the sector collaborating together to tackle those challenges?
It's a really good question, and I think actually Cecilia's just articulated many of the challenges that many of our growers are still facing. So some are having great successes, and they are successfully producing crops which many would have said was, it was impossible. But the reality is, when we ask them, 80% we did a survey recently, 80% said it was very challenging this year, particularly around nutrition and irrigation. We had an incredibly hot spring and going into summer, and that means you need to have more people doing more things, watching the crops more closely. We've had crop failures, all of the things that we've talked about. And ultimately, this all comes down to cost. And before I came here, I asked a few people, what do you estimate the cost of alternatives to peat are that it's ultimately costing you? And I heard 25-30% more than peat. And that is an awful lot of money for many businesses. We're almost entirely SMEs. Like many parts of the world, our sector is very fragmented, and we have no two businesses alike. And it is really very difficult. The other area to mention is around quality and consistency in quality, and that has been an issue, and it continues to be an issue. There's some excellent examples out there, but we also hear many stories and feedback where that consistency, due to supply chain challenges, just hasn't been able to be achieved. And I guess the final sort of area, and this is one where I actually spend most of my time talking about, is cross-border trade and how challenging it is to import into the UK. We import a lot. So 90% of our businesses import some sort of plant or plant product at a stage of the growing process. And as far as I know, you can't test for peat, and you're not going to start testing at the border, we hope. But that seems really quite that's a fundamental point, and it goes back to your question around what is it that we're actually looking for, because there is no single alternative, and I think that was on one of the first slides. There's no silver bullet for this one. So what are we doing about it was the second part of your question. Well, I think we're doing things like this. So we're talking about it, and we're continuing to talk about it. I mentioned earlier some of the things that we're doing to support the industry working together. The key response that we get when we ask people, what do you want? And they want knowledge, and they want to transfer that knowledge, and that's absolutely key. But no two businesses are the same, and no two areas, climates, crops. So we are in a situation where we're just trying to do as much as we can to work together, and then also look to the likes of what the work of GME and others are doing to really further that and get as much detail as possible. And that's really what we can do, but it is around time, and the time to trial, and the time to keep working at it and innovating. And the other area that we don't talk very much around is equipment is needed that's very different. So handling the machinery, whether it's potting machines or whatever it might be, baling, that they are different, and that comes with cost, and it comes with investment, and it takes time.
Okay, thank you. I just wondered whether there's anyone has a comment or a question they want to make to the panel at this point. Arte. Yes,
good morning.
Microphone is coming, hold on.
Good morning, everyone. Arte van der Veer from NPS. First of all, a great panel, good discussions. Kudos to Cecilia for also the how do you say it, the proactive voice saying, hey, we need to look at peat in a structured way. I myself have been involved with RHP quite some time ago. And also a question then to Julia. How do Horticert and RHP, for example, compare? Do you cooperate? Is there a common strategy working forward, or are you working as competitors in the market?
Thank you. I was expecting that somebody will bring this up. So great that I can answer for everybody. So as I pointed out, we are a scheme that covers the sustainability of the alternatives, right? RHP is representing the peat production and the qualitative aspects of peat per se. So in this origin, we are not a competitor, we're just acting on different materials on the one hand, and on the other hand on different aspects of the performance of the material. So RHP is on the qualitative side, on the functionality of the materials that we're not gonna touch because it's already covered pretty well. We are focusing on the sustainability of the production of the alternatives. So it's not comparable, it goes in parallel.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Tim, and then over here, okay. Say just who you are first.
Tim Edwards from the UK. I used to be a grower, and in fact, my Saturday job, even back in the 70s, was on a garden centre, and even then in the UK, we were concerned about protests regarding peat. So I've been around throughout the whole of the UK debate on peat, and I think I've probably got some comments and possibly even some advice. There's two very distinct opinions appearing on the panel there, and I think that's really interesting. If I think back to how things developed in the UK in the very early days, as Jack said when he introduced this topic, we all knew how difficult it was to grow in a different media, and Jennifer's mentioned the problems that growers are facing this year, which has been a very hot year. Actually, my recollections go right back to when container plants were first introduced, and there were occasionally massive disasters growing in pure peat because growers weren't used to hot weather. We had to learn how to grow in peat. If you're going to change that to something different, you've got to learn all over again. We made objections, exactly the same objections that Cecilia is making in the, what would it have been, 80s, 90s. We were pointing out that there was vastly more peat used in energy production than there was in horticulture, and we were trying to find logic to avoid moving away from peat. There were also some policy or some political cock-ups in the UK. I remember the UK's peat reduction targets being set, which were set by the government without any consultation. Well, there was consultation, but there wasn't consultation with the industry that was listened to. And so there were targets that were set that were completely fanciful, and there was no way they were going to be hit. And so when they approached, they were abandoned. Actually, if you look at what's happened in the UK, as I say, I go back a long way there. Initially, we were trying to pretend it wasn't a real issue. It was an issue, it didn't go away, and there's enormous progress has been made in the UK. There are now solutions. Okay, we get a particularly hot weather, and the growers are going to struggle. As I said, I remember growers struggling in hot weather when peat was first introduced. The model that the Germans are starting to talk about, not saying we're going to have peat zero by a given date, but by saying we're going to work towards it, is much more sensible. Actually, it's quite damaging when you set targets and then abandon them. It's much more sensible to work with the industry and to work towards targets that the industry believe that they can attain. So my suggestion is that the industry take it on board as a real issue, but then try to work with government towards ever reducing targets, because it is a real issue. Nobody dies through the use of peat, But we're all familiar with the idea that back in the 50s, doctors were advising patients with respiratory problems to smoke. You know, sometimes you look back and you realize what was happening at a point in time was completely wrong. And I do think we're going to look back at the use of peat and say that was completely wrong. What we've got to do is work together to find solutions and implement those solutions in an achievable time frame.
Okay, thanks, Tim. We're pretty much out of time, but I'm just going to go for that just over here. You want to comment?
Yeah.
Short, yes?
Yes.
Thank you.
First of all, the German government, I'm not sure it's because they're being sensible. They just can't put a ban legally because we're the EU. So you cannot ban peat, even if you wanted to. You'd have first to leave the European Union. So
that's possible.
Then again, why do you think? Yeah, wouldn't advise it though. But okay, that's a different topic. Second, do you know the LCA numbers of peat compared to other materials? Because you would be surprised, because, and that's, again, it's not us, the industry, who has calculated that. The footprint of peat compared to other materials is not necessarily higher. It depends on a lot of factors. That is just science, and people are surprised by it. And then, very important as well, GME has many members who don't use peat at all, and we believe that a lot of plants can be grown peat-free, and it's fantastic that there's a lot of progress because, again, if you look at the demand, between now and 2050, it will grow more than 400%, which is good, and you say people are dying. People might die when there's less forests, less plants, less green cities, and so on. Growing media help people.
Okay, we leave it hanging there. Just want final comment over here.
I'm Johan Stessens from Botanisk. I'm a professional perennial grower, and I'm growing it in pots. I'm using a lot of substrate. So I have an observation, I have a question. My observation is the closer you get to the UK, the more important the peat problem is. The further you go away from the UK, I don't see any problem anymore. This is an international audience, so maybe we can check if my observation is right. Now for Cecilia, I have a question. I'm growing perennials in pots. I'm using substrate. How long will I be able to do this? Because the skyrocketing demand of substrates and alternatives as peat, how will we address this? I think the question is, can we still continue growing plants in pots like we do for how many years?
Well, it depends a lot on the political frame, right? And I said it before, there is a huge, huge, huge demand in Asia and less environmental concerns in general. So that's what I tell the political decision makers I'm talking to on EU level. Look, if you now, after big changes in the geopolitical situation, have understood that it makes a lot of sense to protect our European economy, right? Like the industry sectors, and not only the car industry, but also horticulture. Horticulture is one of the few sectors where the European Union is still kind of front runner worldwide, right? The best greenhouse technology is Dutch. We can be very proud of our horticulture in Europe. But that can change very fast if you would, start banning peat or other materials. No, the EU has to think of horticulture as something to protect, and that means protect everything horticulture needs, and that includes growing media and all the raw materials. That also includes the right chemical plant protection and fertilizer and all of that. So if the EU, and we are working on that, understands we should protect our horticultural sector, because otherwise Asia will just run past us, right? Then you have a good chance to do that forever. And if you produce substrates in Europe and you want to help us get there, you should join Growing Media Europe.
Okay, thank you. I have a feeling this discussion, it's okay, Jack, I'll just finish off. I think this discussion will keep going through the break time, but we have to break now. Thank you very much to Cecilia, and to Jennifer and to Julia, and for participating in this. Please give the panel a round of applause. Thank you.